The smell of disinfectant hit David like a wall as he pushed through the heavy glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as he hurried down the long hallway, clutching a small bouquet of daisies he'd picked up from the gift shop. His grandmother had always loved daisies. She said they reminded her of sunshine on cloudy days. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. Another text from his study group asking where he was. He'd already missed 2 classes this week because of these hospital visits. His economics professor wasn't happy about it either. But how could he explain that his grandmother was more important than learning about market trends? She was the only family he had left, and the doctors weren't giving him much hope anymore. As he walked through the maze of corridors, David felt that familiar knot in his stomach, the same feeling he'd been carrying around for months now. Everything in his life felt uncertain. College felt pointless. His faith, which his grandmother had carefully nurtured throughout his childhood, seemed to slip away a little more each day. He found himself asking questions that had no easy answers. If God was real, why was his grandmother suffering? Why did good people have to go through so much pain? The elevator was taking forever. David checked his watch and decided to take the stairs instead. He needed to burn off some of this nervous energy anyway. As he climbed to the 4th floor, he thought about the conversation he'd had with his grandmother last week. She'd held his hand with her frail fingers and told him she wasn't afraid to die. She said she'd lived a good life and was ready for whatever came next. But David wasn't ready. Not even close. When he reached the 4th floor, he was slightly out of breath. The cardiac unit was busier than usual today. Nurses hurried back and forth, their soft shoes making whisper sounds against the floor. Families clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. There was something about hospitals that made everyone lower their voices, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the delicate balance between life and death. David was about to head straight to his grandmother's room when something made him stop. In the corner of the waiting area, away from the clusters of families, sat an old man by himself. The man looked to be in his late 70s, with silver hair that had been carefully combed but was now slightly disheveled. He wore a brown cardigan that had seen better days and held a crumpled tissue in his weathered hands. What struck David most was the man's expression. He'd seen sadness before, but this was different. This was the kind of deep, hollow sadness that seemed to come from somewhere beyond tears. The man stared at the floor as if he was looking for answers in the pattern of the tiles. Every few seconds he would lift the tissue to his eyes, though David couldn't tell if there were actually tears or if it was just a habit born from hours of crying. David hesitated. He wasn't good with strangers. Never had been. In college, he was the guy who sat in the back of the classroom and only spoke when called upon. He ordered pizza online to avoid talking to delivery drivers. The idea of approaching someone he didn't know, especially someone who was clearly going through something terrible, made his palms sweat. But something kept pulling his attention back to the old man. Maybe it was the way he sat so perfectly still, as if moving might somehow make things worse. Or maybe it was the fact that in a waiting area full of people he was completely alone. Everyone else had someone with them. A spouse, children, friends. This man had no one. David's grandmother had taught him that sometimes God speaks to us through feelings we can't quite explain. She called it the gentle push. Right now, David felt something pushing him toward this stranger, even though every logical part of his brain was telling him to mind his own business and go visit his grandmother, like he'd planned. He stood there for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably only 30 seconds having an internal debate. What would he even say? "Excuse me, you look sad, can I help?" That sounded ridiculous. The man might think he was crazy, or worse, he might tell David to leave him alone, and then David would feel awful for bothering someone during their worst moment. But the feeling wouldn't go away. If anything, it was getting stronger. David found himself taking a step toward the man, then another. His heart was beating faster now, the way it did before he had to give a presentation in class. Each step felt like it took enormous effort, as if he was walking through thick mud. When he was about 6 feet away, the old man looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and watery, but they held a sharpness that suggested a keen intelligence. For a moment their eyes met, and David felt a jolt of recognition. Not that he knew this man, but that they shared something in this moment. They were both afraid, both dealing with circumstances beyond their control. The man's gaze fell back to the floor, and David realized he'd stopped walking. He was just standing there like an idiot, staring at someone who clearly wanted to be left alone. He should turn around and go to his grandmother's room. That's what any normal person would do. Instead, David found himself moving to the empty chair beside the old man. The plastic seat was cold against his legs as he sat down. He still had no idea what he was going to say. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the hospital, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the soft conversation of nurses at their station. David clutched the daisies in his lap and tried to think of something appropriate to say. Nothing came to mind. He wasn't a minister or a counselor. He was just a 23-year-old college student who was barely keeping his own life together. What comfort could he possibly offer to someone who was clearly dealing with something far worse than anything David had experienced? The old man shifted in his chair and glanced at David from the corner of his eye. David could tell he was wondering why this young stranger had decided to sit next to him when there were plenty of other empty chairs in the waiting area. Finally, David cleared his throat. His voice came out softer than he'd intended when he spoke. Rough day? It wasn't eloquent or profound, but it was honest. And sometimes, David had learned, honesty was the best place to start. The old man let out a long, shaky breath before turning to look at David properly for the first time. His eyes held decades of stories, but right now they were filled with the kind of pain that made David's chest tighten. "You could say that," the man replied, his voice hoarse from hours of worry. He managed a weak smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Though I suppose everyone in this place is having a rough day." David nodded, unsure of what to say next. Up close, he could see the man's hands trembling slightly as he gripped the tissue. There was something about the way he held himself, straight-backed despite his age, that suggested he was used to being strong for other people. "I'm Robert," the old man said after a moment. "Robert Chen. Been sitting here for about 4 hours now." "David," he replied, shifting the daisies to his other hand so he could offer a handshake. Robert's grip was firm despite the trembling, the handshake of someone who'd spent his life meeting new people and making them feel welcome. "Those are lovely flowers," Robert said, nodding toward the daisies. "Someone special?" "My grandmother," David explained. "She's upstairs. Been here for a week now." He paused, then added quietly, "The doctors aren't very optimistic." Robert's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry to hear that. It's hard watching someone you love suffer." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two strangers connected by the universal experience of watching helplessly, while someone they cared about fought for their life. "My wife is in surgery," Robert said suddenly, as if the words had been building pressure inside him and finally burst free. "Emergency surgery. Her heart stopped working properly this morning while we were having breakfast." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. David felt his stomach drop. "I'm so sorry. That must have been terrifying." 52 years, Robert continued, staring at his hands. "We've been married 52 years. We met when we were both teaching at the same elementary school. She was the new teacher, and I was the guy who'd been there forever and thought he knew everything." A genuine smile crossed his face for the first time. "She proved me wrong about that pretty quickly." David found himself leaning forward, drawn into Robert's story despite the circumstances. There was something about the way the older man talked about his wife that made 52 years of marriage sound both incredibly long and incredibly short at the same time. "She always said I talked too much. When I was nervous," Robert went on. "Guess she was right about that too. Can't seem to stop myself today." "It's okay," David said. "Sometimes talking helps." Robert looked around the waiting room, taking in the other families clustered together, offering each other comfort and support. "Our daughter lives in Seattle. She's trying to get a flight, but with the storm out there, nothing's flying. Our son is deployed overseas. Military." He shook his head. "Never thought I'd be facing something like this alone." The word alone hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. David understood that feeling all too well. Even with his grandmother still alive, he often felt incredibly alone in the world. It was one thing to have people in your life. It was another thing entirely to have people who truly understood what you were going through. "The surgeon said it could take anywhere from 4 to 8 hours," Robert continued. "They had to replace a valve, and at her age—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. David watched as Robert's composure began to crack. The older man's shoulders sagged and his breathing became uneven. It was like watching a dam that had been holding back an ocean finally start to give way. "I don't know what I'll do if I lose her," Robert whispered, so quietly that David almost didn't hear him. "We've never spent more than a day apart since we got married. I don't know how to be me without her." The raw honesty in Robert's voice hit David like a physical blow. He'd never heard anyone speak with such vulnerability to a complete stranger. It made him think about his own grandmother, and how lost he'd feel when she was gone. She was his anchor, the one person who'd always believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Without really thinking about it, David reached over and placed his hand on Robert's arm. "She's going to be okay," he heard himself saying. "You said she's been healthy for 52 years, right? That's a strong heart. Strong hearts don't give up easily." Robert looked at him with grateful eyes. "You really think so?" David realized he had no medical expertise, no special knowledge that would make his opinion worth anything. But looking at this man who'd spent his life teaching children, who'd loved the same woman for over half a century, who was sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, trying to hold himself together, David felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in months. "Can I?" David started, then stopped. What he was about to suggest felt crazy, especially since he hadn't prayed in earnest for weeks. But the feeling was there again, that gentle push his grandmother had taught him to recognize. "Can I pray with you?" he asked, the words coming out before he could second-guess himself. Robert's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment David was sure he'd overstepped. He was about to apologize when Robert nodded slowly. "I'd like that very much," Robert said. "I haven't been to church in years, but right now, yes, I'd like that." David felt his heart racing as he reached out and gently took Robert's hand. The older man's skin was soft and papery, but his grip was strong. Around them, the hospital continued its steady rhythm of activity, but somehow their corner of the waiting room felt separate from all of it. David closed his eyes and tried to remember how his grandmother prayed. She never used fancy words or complicated phrases. She just talked to God like he was sitting right there in the room with them. "God," David began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're sitting here today asking for your help. Robert's wife is in surgery right now and he's scared. We both are. We don't understand why these things happen, but we're hoping you're listening." He felt Robert's grip tighten on his hand. "Please watch over her during the surgery," David continued, feeling the words come more easily now. "Give the doctors steady hands and clear minds. Help them fix what's broken and bring her back to Robert safely. And help Robert feel your presence right now, so he knows he's not alone." David paused, thinking about his own grandmother upstairs. "We are also asking you to comfort all the families here today who are waiting and worrying about someone they love. Give us strength to face whatever comes and help us remember that love is stronger than fear." When David opened his eyes, he saw that Robert was crying again, but these tears looked different somehow, less desperate, more peaceful. "Thank you," Robert said, squeezing David's hand one more time before letting go. "I needed that more than you know." David had intended to stay with Robert for maybe 20 minutes before going to see his grandmother. But 20 minutes turned into an hour, then 2 hours, and before he knew it, the afternoon had slipped away. Something about sitting next to this man felt right in a way that David couldn't explain. They talked about everything and nothing. Robert told him about his 40 years of teaching third grade, how he'd watched neighborhoods change and families evolve. He spoke about students who'd struggled with reading and how their faces would light up when the words finally started making sense. David found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. His doubts about his business degree, his fear that he was wasting his life studying something that felt meaningless. "You know," Robert said, unwrapping a granola bar that David had gotten him from the vending machine, "I never planned to be a teacher. I wanted to be a journalist. Thought I was going to change the world by writing important stories." "What happened?" David asked, genuinely curious. Robert chuckled. "Life happened. My father got sick and I needed a job with steady pay and good benefits. Teaching was supposed to be temporary, just until I could figure out my real career." He took a small bite of the granola bar. 40 years later, I realized teaching was my real career. Those kids taught me more than I ever taught them. David thought about this. He'd been so focused on choosing the right major, the one that would guarantee him a good job and financial security. But listening to Robert talk about his students, about the joy of watching a child's face when they finally understood something difficult, made David wonder if he'd been asking himself the wrong questions all along. Do you miss it? David asked. Teaching? Every day, Robert replied without hesitation. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. There's nothing quite like being needed, you know, having someone depend on you to help them figure out their place in the world. A nurse walked by and both men looked up hopefully, but she continued past them to another family. Robert had asked about his wife's surgery twice already, but the nurses could only tell him that everything was proceeding as expected. In hospital time, that could mean anything. Tell me about your grandmother, Robert said, settling back into his chair. She must be special if you're here visiting her every day. David felt a familiar tightness in his throat when he thought about his grandmother. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. I don't really remember them very well, but I remember her picking me up from the neighbor's house that night and promising me that everything would be okay. And was it? Okay, I mean. David considered this. Yeah, it was. Different than it would have been, but okay. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, but she never missed a school play or a baseball game. She taught me how to cook, how to change a tire, how to treat people with respect. Most importantly, she taught me that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that things will work out somehow even when you can't see how. Robert nodded thoughtfully. Smart woman. What does she think about your doubts? About college? That's the thing, David said, running his hand through his hair. I haven't told her. She's so proud that I'm the first person in our family to go to college. She worked extra shifts for years to help pay for it. How can I tell her that I'm not sure it's what I want? Maybe she's stronger than you think, Robert suggested gently. In my experience, the people who love us most want us to be happy more than they want us to meet their expectations. Before David could respond, a doctor in surgical scrubs appeared in the waiting area. David felt Robert tense beside him as the doctor looked around the room. Please, David found himself thinking, let it be good news. Family of Margaret Chen, the doctor called out. Robert shot to his feet so quickly that David was afraid he might fall over. That's me, Robert said, his voice shaky. I'm her husband. David stood up too, unsure of what else to do. The doctor walked over to them and David could see Robert holding his breath. Mr. Chen, I'm Dr. Martinez. The surgery went very well. We were able to replace the damaged valve and your wife's heart is responding beautifully. She's stable and resting comfortably. David watched as Robert's knees nearly gave out with relief. Without thinking, David reached out to steady him, and Robert grabbed onto his arm gratefully. Can I see her? Robert asked, tears streaming down his face again. But these were completely different tears than the ones David had witnessed earlier. She's in recovery now, but you should be able to see her in about an hour, Dr. Martinez said with a smile. I have to warn you, she'll be groggy from the anesthesia, and she'll have quite a few tubes and wires attached to her for monitoring. But all of that is normal. After the doctor left, Robert sank back into his chair and covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook, and David realized he was crying harder now than he had all day. But these were tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming joy. She's okay, Robert kept repeating. She's okay. David found himself getting emotional too, even though he'd never met Robert's wife. There was something about witnessing such raw human emotion, such pure love and relief, that made his own heart feel full. I think that prayer of yours worked, Robert said, looking up at David with red eyes and a huge smile. David felt a strange warmth in his chest. He hadn't felt this connected to his faith in months, and it had taken sitting with a stranger in a hospital waiting room to remind him what prayer could feel like when it came from a place of genuine concern for another person. I should call my daughter, Robert said, pulling out an old flip phone, and see if I can reach my son somehow. While Robert made his calls, David texted his study group to let them know he wouldn't make it to their session tonight. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel guilty about missing something school-related. This felt more important somehow. When Robert finished his calls, he turned to David with a serious expression. I want you to know something, he said. What you did today, sitting here with me, praying with me, I don't think I could have gotten through this alone. You probably saved my sanity. David felt embarrassed by the praise. I didn't really do anything. I just sat here. That's exactly what I needed, Robert insisted. Someone to just sit here to listen, to care about what happened to someone they'd never met before. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. Can I ask you something? Of course. What you said about not knowing if college is right for you, about feeling like you're wasting your life. Have you ever thought about teaching? The question caught David off guard. Teaching? Not really. I mean, I always liked school, but I never thought about being on the other side of it. Robert smiled. You have the most important quality a teacher needs. You know how to listen, and you genuinely care about people. Everything else can be learned. David had never thought of himself as teacher material. He was quiet, unsure of himself, still figuring out his own life. But something about the way Robert said it made him wonder if maybe he'd been looking at his uncertainty all wrong. Maybe not knowing what you wanted to do wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was just the first step toward finding something that actually mattered. 3 weeks later, David found himself dialing Robert's number while sitting in his dorm room, surrounded by economics textbooks that felt more pointless than ever. He'd been thinking about their conversation at the hospital almost every day since then. Something about that afternoon had shifted something inside him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. David, Robert's voice came through the phone, bright and cheerful. I was just thinking about you. How's your grandmother doing? David smiled at the genuine warmth in Robert's voice. She's hanging in there. Had a good day yesterday, actually. The doctors think the new medication might be helping. He paused. How's Margaret? Oh, she's doing wonderfully. Complaining about the restrictions the doctor put on her gardening, which means she's feeling like herself again. Robert chuckled. She wants to meet you, by the way. I've told her all about the young man who sat with me during the longest day of my life. The conversation felt easy and natural, like talking to an old friend rather than someone he'd known for just a few hours. David had exchanged numbers with Robert before leaving the hospital that day, but he'd been nervous about actually calling. What if their connection had just been a product of the intense emotions of that moment? What if they had nothing to talk about in normal circumstances? But talking to Robert now, David realized their connection was real. There was something about the older man's perspective on life that David found both comforting and challenging. Actually, Robert said, and David could hear something shift in his tone. I was hoping you might have some time to meet up. There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. David felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with nervousness. Sure, is everything okay? Everything's fine, Robert assured him quickly. Better than fine, actually. But this is something I'd rather discuss in person. Are you free this Saturday afternoon? They arranged to meet at a small cafe near campus, and David spent the rest of the week wondering what Robert wanted to discuss. He'd mentioned during their hospital conversation that he was volunteering somewhere, but David couldn't remember the details. His mind had been pretty focused on Margaret's surgery at the time. Saturday came and David arrived at the cafe a few minutes early. He ordered a coffee and found a quiet table by the window, watching people walk by on the sidewalk outside. College students hurried past with backpacks and textbooks, and David found himself wondering how many of them actually knew what they wanted to do with their lives. He'd always assumed he was the only one who felt lost and uncertain about the future. Robert arrived right on time, looking healthier and more relaxed than he had at the hospital. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, and there was a lightness to his step that spoke of relief and renewed hope. You look good, David said as Robert sat down across from him. Margaret must be recovering well. She is, thank you. The doctors say her recovery is going better than they expected for someone her age. Robert smiled. She's already planning our next vacation. Apparently, having heart surgery has made her more determined than ever to see the places we've been putting off visiting. They chatted for a few minutes about Margaret's progress and David's classes, but David could sense that Robert had something specific on his mind. Finally, Robert leaned forward slightly and clasped his hands together on the table. David, I want to tell you about something I've been involved with for the past 2 years. Robert began. After I retired from teaching, I thought I was done with education. I was looking forward to sleeping in, reading more books, maybe taking up golf. He shook his head with a self-deprecating smile. Turns out retirement wasn't for me. I was bored out of my mind within 6 months. David listened intently, sensing this was leading somewhere important. A friend of mine told me about a literacy center downtown that works with kids from low-income families. Many of these children are reading significantly below grade level by the time they reach middle school. Without intervention, most of them will struggle academically for the rest of their lives. Robert's voice took on the same passion David had heard when he'd talked about his teaching career. So I started volunteering there 2 afternoons a week. That sounds amazing, David said, and he meant it. He'd never thought much about literacy issues, but the way Robert described it made it sound like critically important work. It is amazing, Robert agreed. These kids are incredibly bright and creative, but they've just never had access to the kind of reading instruction that many children take for granted. When you see a 10-year-old finally read their first complete book, or watch a teenager realize they can actually understand what's written on a page, it's powerful stuff. David could see the enthusiasm lighting up Robert's face as he talked. It reminded him of how his grandmother looked when she talked about her work at the local food bank, where she'd volunteered for years. But here's the thing, Robert continued. I've been working on developing a special program at the center, something that pairs older kids who are struggling readers with volunteer tutors in a more intensive long-term relationship. The idea is to create real mentoring connections, not just academic support. David nodded, starting to get an idea of where this conversation might be heading. The program has been approved, and we have funding for the next 2 years, but we need volunteers who can commit to working with the same child for at least 6 months. People who are patient, caring, and genuinely interested in making a difference in a young person's life. Robert paused and looked directly at David. I keep thinking about how you sat with me that day at the hospital, how you listened, really listened, and cared about what was happening to someone you'd never met. That's exactly the kind of person these kids need. David felt his heart start beating faster. You want me to volunteer? I want you to consider it, Robert said carefully. I know you're busy with school, and I know you have a lot on your plate with your grandmother's health. But I also remember what you said about feeling like your studies don't have much meaning. This would have meaning, David. Real, tangible meaning. David stared out the window, watching a group of kids playing soccer in the small park across the street. He thought about his economics textbook sitting in his dorm room, about the business degree he was pursuing because it seemed practical and safe. Then he thought about Robert's face when he talked about his students, about the joy and sense of purpose that came through in every word. What would it involve exactly? David asked. Robert's eyes lit up. You'd work with one specific student, probably a middle schooler, for 2 hours every Saturday afternoon. The first month would be assessment and relationship building. After that, you'd work together on reading comprehension, writing skills, and general academic confidence. But more than that, you'd be a consistent adult presence in their life, someone who believes in them and shows up every week. And you think I could actually help? David asked, his voice betraying his uncertainty. David, Robert said seriously, what you did for me that day at the hospital wasn't just kindness. It was a gift. You have a natural ability to connect with people, to make them feel seen and valued. These kids need exactly that kind of presence in their lives. David felt something stirring inside him, the same feeling he'd had when he'd felt compelled to sit next to Robert in the hospital waiting room. It was scary and exciting at the same time. Could I maybe visit the center first? David asked. Just to see what it's like before I commit to anything? Robert's smile was radiant. I was hoping you'd say that. 6 months later, David stood in front of his academic advisor's office holding a form that would change everything. His hands were slightly shaky as he gripped the paper that would officially switch his major from business to education. After 3 years of studying economics and finance, he was about to throw it all away to become a teacher. At least, that's what his roommate had said when David told him about his decision. You're throwing away a guaranteed career to work with kids who probably don't even want to learn, his roommate had argued. Teachers don't make any money, man. You'll regret this. But as David knocked on his advisor's door, he knew he wouldn't regret it. Not after what he'd experienced over the past 6 months at the literacy center. It had started with that first visit Robert had arranged. David had walked into the converted warehouse space expecting to stay for maybe an hour, just to be polite. Instead, he'd spent the entire afternoon watching kids work with their tutors, listening to Robert explain the program, and meeting some of the children who would potentially be his students. One kid in particular had caught his attention. 12-year-old Tony had been sitting alone at a table, staring at a book with obvious frustration. When David asked him what he was reading, Tony had slammed the book shut and said, I'm not reading anything. I can't read. I'm too stupid. David had felt his heart break a little bit hearing those words come out of a child's mouth. He'd sat down next to Tony and said, You know what? I felt stupid in math class for years. Turns out I just needed someone to explain it differently. That conversation had led to David volunteering to work with Tony specifically. What he'd thought would be a few hours on Saturday afternoons had gradually expanded into the most important part of his week. Tony had been right about one thing. He was struggling with reading. But he definitely wasn't stupid. Over the weeks, David discovered that Tony was incredibly creative, especially when it came to storytelling. He could make up elaborate adventures and complex characters, but he couldn't get those stories down on paper because the mechanics of reading and writing felt impossible to him. So David had started with something different. Instead of focusing on traditional reading exercises, he'd ask Tony to tell him stories. David would write them down and then they'd read them together. Slowly, Tony began to see that reading wasn't about decoding mysterious symbols on a page. It was about discovering stories and ideas. The breakthrough had come in month 3. Tony had been working on a story about a kid who could talk to animals, and he'd gotten so excited about it that he'd grabbed the pencil from David's hand and started writing himself. His spelling was terrible and his handwriting was barely legible, but he was writing, really writing. "Look, Mr. David," Tony had said, using the title he'd insisted on even though David had told him a dozen times to just call him David. "I wrote it myself." David had felt tears in his eyes as he'd read Tony's story. Not because it was particularly good, though it was creative and funny, but because of what it represented. This kid who'd been convinced he was too stupid to learn was discovering that he had something valuable to say. But Tony wasn't the only one who'd been transformed by their time together. David had found himself looking forward to Saturday afternoons in a way he'd never looked forward to his business classes. He'd started reading about different teaching methods in his spare time. He'd asked Robert hundreds of questions about child development and learning differences. Most importantly, he'd discovered something about himself that he'd never known before. He was good at this. Really good. He had a natural instinct for figuring out how different kids learned best, and he genuinely enjoyed the process of helping them discover their own capabilities. The other volunteers at the center had started asking him for advice. Parents had requested him specifically for their children. Even the center's director had pulled him aside to tell him he was a natural educator. "Come in," called his advisor's voice from behind the office door. David took a deep breath and walked into the small, cluttered office where Professor Williams sat behind a desk covered in papers and coffee cups. "David," Professor Williams said, looking up from his computer, "this is unexpected. What can I do for you?" David handed over the form. "I want to change my major." Professor Williams took the paper and read it, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Education? That's quite a shift from business. What's prompted this decision?" David had practiced this conversation in his head dozens of times, but now that he was here, he realized all his prepared explanations felt inadequate. How could he explain what it felt like to watch a child's face light up when they finally understood something they'd been struggling with? How could he describe the sense of purpose he felt when he was working with kids who just needed someone to believe in them? "I've been volunteering at a literacy center," David said finally, "working with kids who are behind in reading, and I realized that this is what I want to do with my life. Not just volunteer, but really dedicate my career to education." Professor Williams leaned back in his chair. "David, you're 3 years into your business degree. You only have 1 year left. Are you sure you want to start over?" "I'm not starting over," David said, surprised by the confidence in his own voice. "I'm finally starting. The past 3 years feel like time I spent preparing for a life I didn't actually want." Professor Williams studied him for a moment. "You know teaching is a challenging profession, right? The pay isn't great, the hours are long, and you'll face bureaucracy and budget cuts and parents who think they know how to do your job better than you do." David nodded. "Robert, that's my mentor at the literacy center. He's told me all about that. But he's also told me about the rewards, and I've seen them myself. When a kid who thought they were stupid realizes they're actually smart, just different, there's nothing else like it." "Well," Professor Williams said, signing the form, "it sounds like you've found your calling. The education department will be lucky to have you." As David walked across campus toward the education building, he pulled out his phone to call Robert with the news. But first he had another call to make. "Hi, Grandma," he said when she answered. "How are you feeling today?" "Better, sweetheart. The new medication is really helping." "How are your classes going?" David smiled, thinking about how different this conversation would have been 6 months ago. Back then, He'd been dreading her questions about school because he'd had nothing positive to say. Now he couldn't wait to share his news. "Actually, I have something to tell you," he said. "I changed my major today. I'm going to be a teacher." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment David worried that she'd be disappointed. She'd been so proud of him for pursuing business, so hopeful that he'd have financial security. "Oh, David," she said finally, and he could hear the emotion in her voice. "I'm so proud of you." "Really? You're not disappointed that I'm giving up the business degree?" "Sweetheart," she said with a laugh, "I've been waiting for you to figure out what actually made you happy. I've known since you were little that you had a gift for helping people. I just had to wait for you to discover it yourself." That evening, David sat in his dorm room, looking at his economics textbooks one last time before packing them away. His phone buzzed with a text from Tony. "Mr. David, I finished the book you gave me. Can we start a harder one next week?" David smiled as he typed back, "Absolutely. I'm proud of you, Tony." As he hit send, David realized that the prayer he'd said 6 months ago in a hospital waiting room had been answered in ways he never could have imagined. He'd asked for comfort for a stranger, but somehow in offering that comfort, he'd found his own path. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to discover who you're meant to be is to focus on helping someone else discover who they are. Tony was reading now. Really reading. And David was finally living, really living. All because one day he'd felt compelled to reach out to a stranger who needed a friend.